Fantastic, David. Thank you so much. He is to be followed now by Victor Perton. Victor is a barrister, public speaker, compere, moderator, mediator, arbitrator, roundtable facilitator, and is currently on the board of several public and private organisations. Victor spent 18 years as a Victorian parliamentarian until 2006, after which he then became Commissioner to the Americas based in San Francisco. Following this, he was Senior Engagement Advisor supporting Australian leadership of the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors and in the Brisbane G20 Leaders Summit, which was described by the Prime Minister as the most important gathering ever hosted in Australia. Victor connects excellent people and great ideas, and is one of the best networked people in Australia, and I dare say the world, but I know. He is also the founder of the Australian Leadership Project, which is an amazing project with some really wonderful insights, which he'll share some of those with you today. And he is also the author of The Case for Optimism. Victor and I are also now working on a project called the Purposeful Optimism Project, which I'm very much looking forward to in terms of how we help people start to really focus on what is purposeful and how we can be optimistic about it. Victor and I actually met way back at university days at Monash University, and we've reconnected several years ago, and it's such a pleasure to have Victor now come and present to you on the case for optimism and Australian leadership. Please welcome Victor Perton.
Well, like many of you, I was up at 4:30 this morning, excited by the prospect of this event, and I don't think we've been let down. I always think that Sue must talk to God, because these breakfasts are always accompanied by a wonderful sunrise. David suffered from it in his presentation, but I think God was smiling on this gathering. And then David's effervescent speech. Just so right. It's working on the G20, you know, when you're looking at 5, 10, 15, 20-year projections full of bleakness. You know, when the IMF head, Christine Lagarde, who's a lovely person, comes and speaks to the G20, she's always concerned about uncertainty. And yet the world has kept getting better. The growth rates, as David has pointed out, has got better. A 10-year-old girl today has more chance of living to 90 than a 10-year-old girl had of living to 10 just 150 years ago. So these statistics are incredible. Let me talk to you firstly about the journey that has brought me here today. I had a wonderful time as a Victorian Member of Parliament. Firstly, we were in the midst, the young people here of school age wouldn't even understand this, but in the early 90s, Melbourne faced the prospect of being the Detroit of Australia. The State Bank had gone broke, there was chaos, there was unemployment, there were 18% interest rates, there was the recession we had to have, manufacturing was collapsing, people were moving to Queensland, it was net negative migration to Melbourne. But what happened was people pulled together. We had a tough Premier elected, we had the business sector set up, we had the not-for-profits set up, we had the families, the old families of Melbourne set up, and we had the Committee for Melbourne, which partly led the effort. And in those years that have followed, just over 20 years, we turned Melbourne from the prospect of Detroit to, in fact, 6 years running now, 7 years running, as the Economist's top-ranked city for livability. And that, for me, was an amazing period to work through. Then the internet arose, and I had the opportunity to work on the e-government strategies of both the Victorian government and the federal government. And the things we did here with e-government and the first free public access in public libraries in the world, the first broadband networking of schools and hospitals. Do you remember the maxi kiosks in the supermarkets where we were trying to get people to understand what the internet was? Bill Gates wrote about what we were doing in business at the speed of thought, as Melbourne at the leadership of e-government, of e-society. It was a marvellous time, but after 18 years in Parliament in 2006, as the cowboy movie recommends to us, a man has to know his limitations, and it was time for me to move on. So I had my own entrepreneurial business, and then in 2008 I was asked to go to the United States to be Commissioner to the Americas, selling foreign direct investment into Victoria and helping to sell Victorian exports. Well, as you can imagine, I arrived in the United States, in San Francisco, in the middle of the GFC. People thought I had the hospital pass. How could you possibly persuade American corporations to invest more in Australia, to import more from Australia in the midst of economic chaos? Well, the answer, as those of you who've worked in the United States and in South America know, it actually wasn't that hard. The Americans have this incredible positive impression of Australians. The chairman of Caterpillar, I visited him in Peoria. Those of you with a public relations degree will remember the slogan, if it plays in Peoria, it plays anywhere. Chairman of Caterpillar looked me in the eye and said, "You Aussies remind me of the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." Boeing, we sold the message that RMIT and the Melbourne universities were the centre of modern aerospace engineering. And when Boeing had to make a decision on where they were going to develop the components for the Dreamliner, they built one of the biggest facilities in the world, their biggest facility outside the United States, here at Fisherman's Bend. Australian expertise was so sought after. I met John Huntsman, the then governor of Utah, who ultimately ran for the Republican primary nomination. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "We should be doing more with you on water." Australian water leadership is exemplified by the Melbourne company Rubicon, rebuilding the irrigation systems of California. When I went to visit the Secretary General of the Brazil Olympics, taking a delegation of Melbourne sporting management and goods companies with me, the Secretary General of the Brazil Olympics said to me, "I only have two ambitions. One is to have an Olympic Games as good and as fun as Sydney, and to have a legacy as good as Melbourne 1956, which still builds on the infrastructure of the 1956 Olympics and has a worldwide reputation for sporting excellence." So much so that the last story I'll share with you on that front was I was at the Milken conference. You remember Milken, the junk bond king who did time in jail? He's rehabilitated himself and runs a marvellous conference in Los Angeles called the Milken Conference. And I was sitting in a panel and Rupert Murdoch and John Leckliter, the head of Eli Lilly, was speaking. And at the end of the speech, as happens at these American conferences, everyone rushed towards Murdoch wanting to have a word with him or his PR people, and Leckliter was sort of standing on the side. So I bowled up to him and said, "Hi, I'm Victor from Melbourne. We'd love to have Eli Lilly do more drug trials in Melbourne." And he looked at me and said, "Don't let my wife hear you. She's killing me to go to the tennis in Melbourne." Of course, I sent a bundle of tennis brochures to his household, and ultimately they did visit the tennis. But what was interesting was his test for my sincerity was, "Come to Indianapolis and I'll have a chat with you." Even from San Francisco, Indianapolis is a 3-flight trip, and it's probably his test. And I arrived in Indianapolis, and those who've been there, the air stinks from the factories. But I got to the gate of Eli Lilly, and there was the Australian flag flying. I got into the conference room, and the catering manager was so excited to have an Australian there that she got out the silver service she'd last used for Prince Andrew. And they had baked lamingtons and party pies. Now, lamingtons and party pies are not big in America, but this was the excitement that an Aussie was coming to town. And, without telling too much more of that story, but whether it's Eli Lilly or Pfizer or any of the big American drug companies, they know Melbourne. They know that the Comprehensive Cancer Centre is one of the 3 leading centres in cancer. And one of the reasons, when David talks about the lifespan here in Australia, one of the reasons that we have such a great lifespan, particularly for women and men as well, is that all of these drug companies come here to bring the newest and the best in drugs because they know we are world leaders in safe drug trials and applying the appropriate protocols. So it was a marvellous 3 years. We had many successes, both in exports and attracting foreign direct investment, even in the middle of the GFC. I then had a wonderful opportunity to work for Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott on the G20 presidency. And Joe Miklius was here. Joe was Chief of Staff to one of the co-chairs of the B20. And if I thought that, travelling in America and you sit in a cafe on Route 66 and you hear the truck driver saying, "I love that Aussie beer, Foster's," or you meet the distinguished lawyer at a dinner in Chicago and he says, "I love that red wine of yours, Jacob's Creek." When you meet the global elite, and Joe saw this at a number of events, they have the same view and the same trust of Australians. One story, in the midst of the chaos around the Russians downing the Malaysian flight over the Ukraine, and our Prime Minister saying he was going to shirt front the Russian president. Of course, the Russians love that. You've seen pictures of the president. He was just waiting for a shirt fronting with Tony. But we were hosting a G20 cocktail party in Washington in the Library of Congress. And there was the Russian finance minister standing at the wall. No one was talking to him. So I went over, I had a bottle of wine. "How are you, Minister? How are things going?" "Ruble is through the toilet. Oil prices through the toilet. Your sanctions are biting. How do you think I feel, Victor?" I said, "Well, this wine's really good. It's from one of our best wineries," and we carried on a conversation. But the critical point is that go forward 6 months when we were negotiating for a unanimous resolution on the establishment of the Global Infrastructure Hub, Sergei, his deputy, comes to me and says, "Victor, we have a problem. You would all be ashamed of me," because I said, "Sergei, what is problem?" And he's explaining the problem, and I'm saying, "Look, we've actually got the Brazilians on side and the Chinese are on side. Look, just, this will be great." And the minister, who was sort of standing about where you are, just wandered over and said, "Sergei, I trust Victor. We go with the Australians." And it was this, he said to me later, he said, "No one will ever die wondering what an Australian thinks." It's this authenticity that we have that enabled us to lead what was a fantastic G20 exercise. At the end of that process, my family life had changed and my children were here in Melbourne, and it's nicer to pick up your kid at 3:15 than to be flying to Indianapolis. And I moved back to Melbourne, and work wasn't hard to come by, as Sue said, and as David has explained why. But I was astonished by the level of negativity here in this country. Number 1 or 2 on the United Nations Development Index. Number 1 on the OECD Good Life Index. 5 of our cities in the top 15 on the Economist of ranking of cities. On the HSBC Expat Index, number 1 for bringing your children to live somewhere, along with Paris. And yet everywhere I went, there was this hopelessness. David used to cover me when I was in state parliament. He's aged better than me. But the government system is broken. Give me a break. We have an election that moves from public service to public service. We might not like our prime ministers or premiers, but the democracy transfers. Our business leaders are hopeless. They're not innovative enough. They're not expansionist enough. Oh God, the not-for-profits have got no idea of how to run things. I was walking along Beaconsfield Parade in Port Melbourne, and this woman walked up to me and said, "Oh, you guys look like you're talking about something interesting." And I said, "Oh, you were talking about Australian leadership." And she said, "Oh, hopeless, isn't it?" Now, I was bewildered by this, and that's why I established the Australian Leadership Project. And at about the same time as I had the conversation with the lady, the Australian Centre for Workplace Leadership produced a report which said that Australian leadership was hopeless. They had $1 million worth of federal government money to present that report. And of course they said, if you do our master's degree, you'll be fine. The Australian Industry Group a month later produced a report that said Australian management is hopeless. But of course, if you come to our $1,000 day with Marshall Goldsmith, you'll be fantastic. Thankfully, someone gave me a free ticket, and Marshall Goldsmith's a nice guy. but management didn't change so much as a result. So I thought rather than all these anonymous surveys, I would go out and ask people 4 questions. What's your favourite story of an Australian leader? What are the unique qualities of Australian leadership? The question that started me off, what do Australians want of their leaders today? And then a personal question. Who have been the leaders in your life? Who's inspired you? So we've done 1,000 interviews now in the first year of operation. From Australians of the Year to CEOs like Richard Goyder through to 18-year-old undergraduates. And there's a young lady from grade 6. I'm hoping that she's going to do our interview along with some of her friends too. And what are the findings? They shouldn't surprise you. But number 1, the thing that rocks the socks off the world is Australia's egalitarian leadership. There's only one other group of countries that's egalitarian as us, and that's the Scandinavians. And those who've been to Scandinavia know it's a dour, equality. It doesn't bring happiness or radiance. But when the boss here pours the wine or talks about football, which is our expectation of the boss here, it's quite different from the rest of the world. The head of the Argentinian Trade Organisation said to me his socks were knocked off when the boss, Australian boss that he was working for, poured the wine around the reception. I had a Chilean tell me his socks were knocked off when the boss in his company came and started washing the dishes after a cocktail event. It just doesn't happen in Latin America, it just doesn't happen in the United States, and it doesn't happen in Europe. I won't read out that quote, it's in the courts, but Hugh Breakey, who's a global leader in integrity, says the unique qualities of Australian leadership are closely attuned to the Australian spirit of egalitarianism. I don't mean a demand for economic quality, but the principle that no one is intrinsically, by their personal status, education, social class or institutional role, owed the type of special respect that's accorded to a leader. An Australian leader has to earn their leadership stripes. It doesn't come with title. Ed Wilkinson, I interviewed him just after he'd come out of Afghanistan. I mean, if you've got a hard posting as a diplomat, it's Kabul. And he said the one overarching trait that stands out to me amongst Australian leaders is egalitarianism. Of course, when you're working with American and European military and government, Ed saw it close up in a crisis situation, and he says it's one of the reasons we excel. Now, good Australian leaders are funny. Right? One of the things I had to train Australians to do when they were coming to the Silicon Valley with their pitch decks was I had to say you can't use your Australian jokes. An American audience is pretty dour when they're talking about money. And yet in Australia, it's compulsory. A good board meeting doesn't work without a joke. A good exec meeting doesn't work without a joke. The humour we play off each other, with our little verbal stumbles and the like. It's an endearing feature. And Graham Mitchell was head of Walter and Eliza Hall, a very senior guy in the World Health Organisation. If I can sum up that quote, he said, when the Australian delegation walks into the World Health Organisation, the room lights up. It's the humour, it's the smiles. Anyone can tell a story about molecules, but it's only the Australians who will tell a story about a new molecule with a smile and a joke and something that will make people feel happier. Janine Kirk, many of you will know Janine, she's head of Prince Charles's charities here and was the head of the Committee for Melbourne, says Australian leadership has an underlying sense of self-deprecation and humour, which has an ability to put people at ease. And it's so important. The thing that concerns me is you name an Australian leadership course or business course that includes humour, that has a course on jokes. I found Stanford has introduced one. But next time you're thinking about your leadership courses, have a think about, have we got a component on leading with modern Australian humour? I mean, some of the jokes we can't tell anymore, but, the ones that still work. And then good Australian leadership is authentic. we have really finely tuned bullshit meters. And it doesn't matter whether it's our politicians or our business leaders, authenticity is important, but in Australia it's no BS, no bullshit. There's lots of other features, and Pip Marlowe, many of you will know Pip. She was the head of Microsoft in Australia, now head of customer marketplace for Suncorp, so a real selling job. She says, you tend to know when there is an Australian in a meeting, they don't shy away from expressing their views or asking difficult questions in a very straightforward way. My overseas counterparts tell me this can take some getting used to, but it's also a question they respect. And the example of the Russian finance minister I gave earlier is a classic. But the interesting thing that, again, that Sue and I are going to be working on together in Optimism is that in October last year, I was asked to speak on optimism. I'm on the board of the Global Integrity Summit. And you can imagine that global integrity summits are pretty bleak places. Journalists who've been imprisoned, cartoonists who've been imprisoned, torture, corruption, and you get all those statistics about perceptions of corruption are getting worse because you listen to the ABC or watch Channel 7. Of course you think the world's getting worse. And I'd said to this committee, every meeting, I said, exactly as you said, David, but the world's not so bad. Can we talk some optimism? So finally the board said, Victor, you can have a panel on optimism at 3 o'clock on a Friday in Brisbane. You're all imagining, you might be optimists, but you're thinking I had 22 people and a stray dog. 550 people were there. There were 2 tweets a second with the questions. And they weren't just questions about why should I be optimistic or Victor, you're wrong. It was, how do I become more optimistic? And particularly from the children, it was interesting, because they're so used to listening to the news and hearing bad news. Why should I be optimistic? So I thought rather than leave the paper on the floor of the conference, that I'd produce a book. And I asked friends and acquaintances for their views on optimism and the case for optimism. And Professor Jane Burns, some of you would know her from the Young and Well CRC, Professor of Innovation at Sydney, and I'll read this to you. People talk about tenacity and resilience and strength of character, but it is optimism that drives behaviour when on some days it would be easier to say, stop, I give up, it's too hard. Optimism is believing in the impossible and then taking the steps to make it possible. So my first question to you on optimism is, when someone asks you, how are you, how many of you say, not too bad? Like the girls at the checkouts in Coles in Port Melbourne, who I always hassle now and say, what do you really mean? When did you last say, gosh, I'm feeling optimistic? My son, my 13-year-old son, experimented with this at school the other day when a teacher asked him, and he said, it actually lifted the teacher. A 13-year-old kid can lift a teacher by saying, I'm optimistic. Important for leadership, Dominic Barton, the head of McKinsey globally, responded to my request for a quote for the book. And he said this, optimism is the very core of leadership. The best leaders I've encountered in my career are those that remain optimistic and ambitious for their organisations even in the face of great adversity. They are those whose optimism enables them to recognise the potential in others and help them develop to be leaders themselves. And I have in this audience, as well as David having had to put up with my speeches in the past, 2 of the contributors to this book are sitting here. In fact, there were 3, but one had to leave early. Jo, would you just stand up for a moment? So this is Jo Miklius. She is one of the absolute stars of Australian business. And in this book she says, optimism in leadership embodies essential qualities required to lead in a fast-paced and ever-changing world. I think the valuable qualities of an optimistic leadership include self-awareness, flexibility, self-confidence, initiative, resilience, and adaptability. It goes on a bit further, but you get the idea of why she's a leader. And Jeff Kerr-Bell, who leads engagement for the ANZ. Where are you, Jeff? I think you're up there. Stand up. The Olympic athletes were taking hints from you on training earlier, I think. That's why we didn't talk earlier. Optimism is the only essential ingredient in all significant achievement. And so my plea to you, and Sue and I will be talking to you about it more, is dwell on David's message. We actually do live in a pretty fantastic world, and it is getting better. Dwell on Sue's passion for ethical selling, for sustainable selling, for helping sales leaders. Again, one of the things that Andrew and I were talking about at the head table is there aren't enough Australian CEOs who've been sales manager or sales director. And it's time for each of you, if you haven't set your bar at being CEO, it's time for you to set your bar at being CEO. And if we can help you get there, whether it's Jeff, whether it's Joe, whether it's Glenn who was here earlier, or David or Sue or Andrew, you've got friends around you to help you do that. Now, my longest ever speech is 7 hours. I get pretty passionate about this stuff. But I conclude with this. Australia's a great place, as David said. You don't get to where we've got to without good leaders in the organisations in which you're in, as leaders, each of you. And we've got to celebrate that, we've got to understand that, and work out how to spread that message. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me speak to you.